Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Overcoming Pandemic-Related Impacts in the Geosciences, Perspectives from Academic Faculty. This webinar is a larger geoscience COVID impact study, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. I'm Luke Charbonneau, and I'll be moderating today's webinar with Leila Gonzalez, who is also joining us from AGI. In today's webinar, we'll be hearing from different speakers via a panel discussion on pandemic-related impacts to their work, research, and teaching activities. Our speakers today are going to include Andrew Rinsberg, who's a professor with the Department of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of West Alabama. Next, we have Katja Kraft, who's a professor with the Department of Sciences and Engineering at Whatcom Community College. We have Sarah Sheffield, who's an assistant professor with the Department of Geosciences at the University of South Florida. And we have Alyssa Abbey, who's an assistant professor, Department of Geological Sciences at California State University, Long Beach. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our first focus question. Our first focus question today that I'm going to read aloud and then have our panelists dive right into is, what were the major challenges you encountered during the pandemic as it relates to your teaching and research activities? And I'll open the floor for whichever panelist wants to jump in and chime first on this topic.
So I can start if that breaks the tension a little bit. I'm a paleontologist, and a major source of my data are in museums. And of course, when the pandemic started, a lot of the museums had closed and staff weren't allowed in, which limited my ability to travel, of course, due to pandemic travel closures. And then even when museums started opening up, it's only been in the past 6 months or so that we've actually started allowing loans to be processed again. So even though museums have been open, museums haven't been allowing loans to go out and things like that, or travel too. So that was a major challenge because my data sets were just almost completely inaccessible. At the beginning of the pandemic, right before it, also had major surgery that had limited my mobility. So I was not able to do any form of field work, even if it was like local or anything like that, or get data. So pretty much all new data was completely inaccessible for a little while until we figured out some switcheroos, I guess.
It was pretty similar for me. I essentially, when it came to the research component, it was either field work or lab work that was in the midst of happening when the pandemic hit, and so both of those came to a halt. And so there are projects that are just now starting to come back, similar to what Sarah was saying, that essentially were on pause for almost 2 years.
I was in the process of organizing a small international conference, which would be the first at my university, which has been around since 1835, but had never hosted an international conference before. So it was a big deal. And we first had to postpone it while watching many other organizations either cancel meetings that were on regular schedules that were suddenly blown out of the water or postponing them. We postponed a few months and then went virtual. The other main inhibition that we had was for labs and field trips. I mean, we can teach online, but it's difficult to teach people without handling rocks, teach some basic geology. And it's difficult to show them rocks in the field without putting them into a van. I suppose you others also had problems like this?
So I'm at a entirely teaching institution, since I'm at a community college. And so, yeah, it was pretty much the entire need to pivot to suddenly teaching online and teaching effectively online for a student population that's suddenly becoming the what's considered essential workforce. Right? These are the students that are working in the grocery stores and working in the spaces where they're having to suddenly put their own lives at risk. I have other students that are dealing with serious mental health challenges, and also students that are suddenly managing being parents at home with children, just like also colleagues in the work environment. And so I think, all of that became challenging, not to say the least of which, of course, is also just the physical limitations of working in my office are not, my home office is actually a guest bedroom and, not really designed. We have sort of put together pieces of wood. We scrapped wood in order to create a desk so that I could actually have a space to work, right? So all of those sort of suddenly realizing that you sort of had to create a space to make it work for sitting at a computer for long hours. And I had just recently received a grant, so I was also working to try and suddenly shift in terms of what our original approach was going to include classroom observations, and suddenly that couldn't happen. So kind of trying to rethink some of that as well.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you. If a reminder again, if anybody in the audience has a question they want to type in the chat, you can ask that at any point and we'll answer that. Until I see any questions, I'm going to move on to the next focus question. Our next question is, what strategies did you implement to address these challenges that you faced? Did your strategies change over time during the course of the pandemic? Like, how did you see kind of the strategies you were implementing in your practice at the start of the pandemic when everybody didn't know what was going on? How did that kind of evolve over the time frame to where you're at now in this pseudo-endemic era? Whoever wants to start us off with that.
Well, I can hit it from both sides and just say what I did. So for research, I was kind of lucky in the sense that even though I do field and lab work, I also do modeling. So I was able to then essentially, press pause on those other projects and start a whole new collaborative project that was centered around modeling so that I could just use my computer at home for that part. For teaching and trying to get students to actually go on field trips, we implemented essentially our school is at Cal State Long Beach. Almost everyone is a commuter student. And so almost everyone drives to campus anyway and has their own car. And so what we ended up doing is still having outdoor field trips, but each person would drive themselves to the field site. And then we would all work, spread out along the feature we were looking at or anything like that, so that we wouldn't have to all pile into a van. And then over time, that did change. We ended up having approval from the university to put people in vans, but one person per row, all the windows open and masks on as we drove. And so then we were taking lots of vehicles. So there was like times when classes of only 10 to 15 students had 6 or something vans, going out together. So they were really big caravans that were a bit challenging too, because then you have to have drivers that can drive all of the school vehicles. So that changed as well. And so through time it did change. A lot of the students liked driving their own cars because then they would just sleep in their cars instead of setting up tents and all that when we were on field trips, which was it caused its own like social awkwardness sometimes, especially with people who are experienced campers and then not, and that kind of dynamic was a little bit awkward, but now we're back to saying we all have to take the school vehicles. So we're kind of back to semi-normal. We still try to wear masks in the vehicles and keep the windows down, but we are not one per row now.
So for my research, I was a pretty brand new assistant professor. I had started the semester before, and I was actually on medical leave right before the pandemic had started. So it was just like this weird 2020 was such a special time, I think. What a great year, right? So I started just doing review papers because I had no data at that point. I was hired originally as a teaching instructor. So I was teaching 6 courses a year and wasn't doing a whole ton of research, of course. So then as soon as I switched where the data was supposed to start, then everything else happened. So I started with review papers, but maybe it was not so lucky, I guess. But my university has a requirement for a lot of our students that they have to do an internship, which of course all their internships, were completely blown up at this point. So they were desperately seeking for people. So I said, oh, okay, I like, here, can you do some literature searches for me online to kind of replace this? So I was able to get about a dozen undergraduates working with me, which was delightful because my university has just this never-ending stream of wonderful people to work with at the undergraduate level, especially. So they were doing these literature searches with me online to collect big data projects, which now, I mean, they've taken years to get kind of going, but they're starting to actually turn into some really cool projects. For on the teaching side, though, because of my injury, I kind of had to rethink of things because field stuff was out of the question entirely. I would say I was out for quite a few years. So it took a while to kind of readjust my mentality, because we all get taught this mentality of like, geology is field, 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 go out into the field, go look at the rocks. And I was like, I can't do that. I can't bring students. Even today, I'm not really quite able to take students into the field reliably. So we've done a lot of things to shift kind of how I teach things like that, and like introducing different types of things. So in my paleontology stratigraphy course, we work a lot more with museum collections now and kind of introduce students to the non-field aspects of geology. So I made fossil kits by begging fossil clubs from all over the southeastern United States. People from Ohio took pity and mailed me bryozoans for those of us that live in Florida and we don't know what the Paleozoic is. We mailed those out to students, so we still had like samples to look at and things as I was like flipping my class at as quickly as possible. So a lot of shifts, but a lot of great stuff that came out of it.
A lot of this sounds familiar. Owing to my age and medical condition, I taught online for quite some time. And while most of my the faculty at UWA continued to teach in person in fall of 2020 and onward. So I was one of 10 members of the faculty out of 200 that was teaching almost exclusively online. But I did show up for some field trips. And because of the problem of travel, we weren't allowed to. I cobbled together some local field trips. We looked at the buildings on campus and admired how most of that material came out of the ground, and measured bricks and to help with a metric system. And I like you, I had the students all drive to the local cemetery, and we looked at the gravestones and how much they weathered because they were all dated. So it made do with what we had available. The other thing I did with field trips was to go virtual on some of them. So I did go out, take pictures at the graveyard, and so I had a pre-trip slideshow that I could give them, and realized later that slideshow can substitute for a real field trip anytime it rains from here on out. So there's an advantage to a virtual field trip. If I have a student who is handicapped physically, they are not handicapped looking at a computer screen. So, attending southeastern section of the GSA meeting was also revealing, because I attended a couple of virtual field trips there too, including one I was very familiar with. Only the site was only 30 miles away, and it was one of the KT boundary sites at Moscow Landing. And I could admire how Chuck Zabarda put that together. It was really very well done and very educational. And there were things that you could see in his slideshow because the photos had been collected over a period of years that are not actually visible every year. The river goes up and down. You can't always see everything. So I was saying, finding all kinds of advantages to these virtual field trips. In a way, I mean, there isn't anything like actually handling the rocks or being with other people in front of an outcrop. But on the other hand, I can see that I'm not going entirely back to in-person field trips because there are just too many good things about the virtual ones. So that was an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this sounds familiar. Certainly, I mean, one of the challenges we had with trying to have students meet us at places was that not all of our students had access to vehicles. So that was sort of where some of the virtual field trip option came in. I tried to Zoom from my phone, but that, my phone only had a battery that lasted so long, so it didn't really work very well. But I did during the peak of the pandemic, I went and did a series of photos and did a virtual field trip. So I do find that's a nice substitute now as well. One of the things we had an instructional designer on campus, and our campus actually created experts in each of our different sort of divisions, and they became sort of resource people, and they'd have sort of office hours for faculty to check in with. And so it would be nice to kind of hear what other faculty were trying to figure out and navigate and learn from each other and sort of build that community. And then our state ended up creating a community of practice specifically for the geosciences. So then it was faculty in the geosciences across the state where we were having conversations about how we were navigating some of these shifts and changes, so that it helped with some of that isolation as faculty, but also helped us get new ideas and get resources, and created a learning management system where everybody could throw in assignments up there so you could get new ideas and take advantage of that sort of shared resource. One of the other things I think was important was some of the advice we got from our administration was sort of that idea of scaling back and not, trying and do too much for our students and for ourselves. And I think trying to do some of that in my curriculum really forced me to really think about how do I unburden some of my curriculum, which was helpful just because it's something that needed to happen anyway, but also really kind of forced me to sort of think about what were those really true essential things. And then just having peers, being part of a peer network that was really helpful and supportive too.
No, perfect. Thanks. Well spoken by all four of you. A question I see that popped up in the chat is, have there been any permanent changes to degree program requirements for students in your department, such as modes of final defense, capstone projects, theses, dissertation, changes to research projects, or new opportunities for research that you've noticed as a result of the pandemic?
We've made adjustments to the mode of defense and things like that. We've also implemented, not necessarily because of the pandemic, but kind of, I think maybe it became easier to implement due to the pandemic, if that makes sense. But so students are now allowed to present virtually or in person. In my state, things were not closed down for long. So I'm in Florida. And so, we kind of have the option to defend online or in person now, but we were able to make some swaps to our theses and dissertations, and that students can sub in diversity, DEI research, diversity, equity, and inclusion research as the final chapter, or do some science communication, because a lot of students were not able to graduate because they could not get to collect the data, and there were other avenues that we could see that, they could do things that were still going to definitely improve the field and give them an opportunity to make creativity, or, to make creative projects that weren't strict traditional research projects. So that was really helpful, I think, and hopefully that stays.
I'd say at least here, not much changes in terms of the defense or thesis, final capstone type presentations, because we were previously, before the pandemic, we were also doing them almost all virtually anyway, because most of our students, we have a master's program, we don't have a PhD program, but most of those students had members on their committees who were in industry and not at the university. And so they often were working, 5-hour drive away or something like this, and we're not going to come to an in-person defense anyway. And so it turned out that we were already doing that, and then we essentially just learned how to not have so many technical problems, because now everybody knows how to use the different platforms. As far as research goes, we actually had lots of undergraduates help with creating those classroom virtual activities. We were able to have them scan all of the samples that we would normally be giving out as hand samples in class, but they were able to scan them so that they could be rotated in 3D for a virtual lab for a lot of our intro and mineralogy type classes. And so the students were able to learn how to use the various imaging scanners that we were using for those projects, and come in, on their own when nobody else was in the building, to scan them for us and send them to us to make the labs out of. So that ended up counting for their undergraduate research experiences. which was pretty great. And I think, and that's one thing that we're continuing to do, especially because we have in our college, we also have a science education as part of the science college instead of the education college. So we work now very closely with them to create some of these, but through student research experiences, essentially. So that's been a new thing that has changed, and I think will be staying for sure.
We've had few changes to degree programs, but I will say that commencement has been spread out over 2 days and involves 6 different ceremonies now, just to lower the number of people and spread them out a bit. We also, the year before, we had a commencement outdoors, which had not been done for decades, I believe, before that.
Our degree requirements did not change, but we do have course-based undergraduate research experiences for students, and a number of us who offer that for our students expanded the options. It used to just be sort of a poster session, and so sort of standard, do a research poster as your final presentation. And because the screens aren't really the most accommodating for a poster, it allowed us to expand the options, which was kind of nice because we now have students really kind of tapping into their passions along with doing their research. So we have students have created documentary videos, students have created, sort of infographics that become then informative for sharing with the general public, right? So there's sort of a lot of different ways that students have become more creative and being able to tap into sharing their research while also doing that. And I can also mention we just did our first outdoor graduation in a long time, and I prefer it because more family members could actually show up, which was nice. Although it did rain on us, so that got cold.
No, perfect. Thanks for that insight, guys. The next question we have is, do you think the pandemic-related strategies you implemented are temporary measures or likely to remain in place for the foreseeable future?
So some of the measures, so one of the most recent projects I have with students going on right now is a collaborator at the University of Michigan Museum of Paleontology got students during lockdown to help make 3D models of brachiopods, and that were research quality. And so students in Florida were able to actually make measurements and do research analysis on them. And one of the beauties of this is that now these models are online, they're open source, so folks internationally can now access this important group of fossils and things like that. So I hope that we continue this because we're reducing the barriers to international research and, the inherent inaccessibility to museum collections. That's kind of been a really big issue with museums, especially with how extractive folks have been in the past with taking fossils out of the countries that they belong to. So hopefully this is actually a way to kind of start to repair that and make paleontology especially more internationally accessible. So hopefully they stay.
Yeah, I agree. I'm hopeful. As I mentioned before, when I wasn't able to go to the field or into the lab, and I really focused on modeling, I had never done a project that was entirely modeling focused. In fact, I always just used it as an extra little bit in a lot of the research. But I found that more students were able to join and do research if they were able to do all computational or modeling work. And I had a student who had surgery on one foot and then surgery on another and couldn't stand ever to do lab work or field work. And it was perfect because I had already gotten this idea that we could keep doing modeling projects, and it was just as useful, both as ways to make predictions for moving forward on projects or as ways to continue a project that was maybe potentially thought of as done. So I personally intend to keep that kind of a change more prevalent in my research group. And I think, at least for the teaching components, we've been told by more higher ups in the campus that they would like to make our intro classes more online or hybrid, because feedback is that many students want those classes to be online. It's easier to not have to commute to campus every day. If they had a day where every one of their classes was online, then they wouldn't have to spend that one day with all of that travel involved. And so we're actually being pushed to try to convert our introductory classes that are, some of the larger ones that are not for majors particularly, into these really well-made online programs. And so they're encouraging us not to do what we did at the beginning of the pandemic, which was like, oh, quick, let's change and do an online class, but in fact, like, strategically create a material that is pedagogically sound and strong and for online learning. And so we're actually getting a pretty big push from the rest of the campus to create that for our lower division kind of introductory courses.
My college was already heading for doing more online programs before the pandemic hit, and this only accelerated matters, of course. And I would say every faculty member now is comfortable with teaching online, whereas before many of us, including myself, were reluctant to do this. I mean, it wasn't something new. It was easy to get things wrong. I remember struggling with the Blackboard program and managed to delete all the test results from a final. My. But everybody was more lenient. The students allowed for our faculty's mistakes. The faculty allowed for student mistakes. The administration was supportive and told us to be more lenient, to remind us that some students did not have laptop computers and were trying to listen to our lectures on their handhelds. Or that some students would tell me, oh yeah, I want to attend your class, I have to drive to the local hotel and piggyback on their Wi-Fi, or to the local library. So yeah, you're going to have to make some allowances for such things. So, and that kind of thing, I think, is not changing rapidly. I think we're all being a bit more relaxed in a way about these about expectations. I'm trying to be more flexible.
Yeah, I've really tried to embrace sort of the Arundhati Roy's perspective of pandemic as a portal, to really kind of thinking about how do we move forward to make sure that what we're doing is more just and equitable. And so really sort of thinking about that through my curriculum and through my strategies for pedagogy, and every action that I take within both my research and my teaching.
No, perfect. A question I see in the chat that's directed at Alyssa and Sarah, because it relates to your work with models and computational research. With keeping computational research and modeling as part of the options for your students' projects, are you seeing them delve into the use of data science, machine learning, AI in their computational research?
I can say that at least for my students, because we added this more computational modeling component, they have become much more willing and accepting of that kind of work. And before, it was really daunting to say, like, oh, I have to go take a computer science class or something if I want to learn about this cool new AI machine learning that's happening. But they're interested. Now they're actually like taking the steps to do some online learning classes, on their own, which is really cool. I've been hearing them talk about it, like becoming familiar with doing a little bit of coding in MATLAB or on Python gave them just enough confidence to then like push themselves to start thinking about more higher level applications. And I had a student recently who just said, I applied for this workshop on using machine learning for sparse data sets or something like this. And so I was like, wow, this is great. I didn't teach them that. I don't do that work, but there was just enough like movement in that direction that they had the confidence to do that.
And then Sarah, same for you because you also do modeling as well. Did you see that your students were delving more into the use of data science and machine learning as you kind of push them towards that research?
So I was about to say machine learning hasn't really entered my area too much yet, but my
Okay.
students did learn some new, one of my students was going to do a more field-based project, my first graduate student, which clearly did not turn out well, unfortunately. But he did take it upon himself to learn computational fluid dynamics methods and work with the engineering department at my university. So I thought honestly, it opened up a lot of new opportunities, I think. And he really took it upon himself to do a lot of the methods learning, which is all his credit, none of mine, of course. So good job, Stephen, if you're listening. But
Yeah, no, perfect. Thanks for that elaboration. The next topic we have for focus question 4, did you find that your institutions were supportive for the staff, faculty, and postdocs during the pandemic? And if so, what supportive actions did you see them implement during the pandemic?
We had a very proactive administration. Now, UWA is a relatively small school, so it's possible for the university president to meet every faculty member. There are only 200 on-campus faculty members, plus adjuncts. So it's fairly tight. And they got on the ball immediately when the pandemic really hit in March. The school was closed for 2.5 weeks. Everyone was sent home. And then we went online. There was no summer session. And then we met in person in the fall. In between those times, the administrators asked the biology department, of which this paleontologist is a member, for advice on the what to do in this biological emergency. So I was one of a crew of faculty members that trailed the dean and chair through all of the rooms that we used for instruction, figuring out aspects such as ventilation, social distancing, masking, and how individual rooms could be modified to allow for online teaching and so on. So it was wonderful to be asked from the top of the administration for us at the bottom of of the ladder to be asked for our advice, and our advice was taken. One of my pieces of advice was implemented, and it turned out that since UWA got on this very quickly, other state institutions in Alabama took our lead. They took our protocol and adapted it to their own institutions. So a piece of advice that I gave ends up influencing thousands of people, other citizens in the state, which I can be proud. So yeah, I felt that they've been supportive. The president of the school also, on a weekly basis, informed us how matters were proceeding with the pandemic. He would, of course, not name names, but he told us what percentage and what numbers of people were currently quarantined or infected. We quarantined students who contacted other people who were infected, who were not necessarily infected themselves. So we were able to be one of the 7% of national colleges that managed to continue to meet in person because we kept our infection rate generally below 2% for the duration. And those weekly communications by email were a big boost, I think, in everybody's morale because we weren't feeling uncertain about where we were heading.
Since we've mixed up the order, I'll go. Which is to say, I'd say overall, yeah, I think particularly that sort of rapid shift to online, there was a lot of willingness to sort of work with us as faculty. As I mentioned before, we had sort of these online experts that we could tap into in each of our different disciplines. They actually, after moving into, I'm trying to remember when things happened, but essentially we had sort of a period of time where we knew we were going to be moving into potentially hybrid modes. And so they provided compensation for faculty if we showed up to trainings, and even just time to develop some of that hybrid to make sure that we're doing it in a strong, pedagogically sound way, with support structures from our instructional designer. And then they also cut back some of our committee work expectations so that we could focus purely on the teaching and less on some of the service load. They provided, once we were sort of moving back into the classroom, they did provide masks and cut down on the overall number of students in a class so that we could provide greater social distancing. However, they just didn't have the mechanisms in place to do any kind of tracking, and the sort of vaccine requirements were attestation for students, which always felt a little fuzzy. So it was sort of one of those, there were certain things that our school just wasn't able to support in ways that we would have liked to seen. I think some of the greatest challenges is that faculty, I think, felt supported. Our staff, on the other hand, may not have felt as supported. We had a lot of turnover in our staff.
I think it sounds like we had some pretty similar, support from, at least in terms of trying to help with this fast transition. We had also workshops for how to make all of your online material ADA compliant and accessible, and how to make all your documents have the correct formatting so that anyone with screen readers and things like this can use them. And so they have these workshops to make all of your online material meet those requirements. And similarly, we got stipends for going to those workshops, and they were multiple weeks, and they were very useful in the sense that they were timed with how things were going in terms of the pandemic. And so everybody was switching at one point, and then everybody was like getting used to it and having new problems. And so those were the things that were being addressed in the workshop. It was kind of a real-time situation, which was actually really helpful because everybody was working on their own specific courses rather than just like getting some sort of broad brush workshop. It was very applied. And obviously having the stipend was nice, although, not really necessary. Most people were just doing it because like this was going to be helpful. And another thing they did, we have our like instructional design office, I guess, where people that's their whole job is to help with how we work with our learning management system, helping other, all the instructors create materials. And they actually had slots that you could sign up for to work one-on-one with a designer, and you could just make your online version of the class much more interactive and engaging, rather than a sort of cursory plop all these files into Canvas or something and hopefully it works. So they put a lot of time, especially that particular office of people put a lot of time into helping us at the beginning, and they still run all of those workshops, and you can still do them. So all of the new faculty coming in now, for example, are benefiting from all of those workshops, and everything was recorded, so it's all online. You can see it over and over. Sometimes I'll forget like how to do something that we learned in one of these workshops and can go back to those, which is really nice. I think that everybody felt pretty supported. We similarly got weekly emails from our dean that were very much emotionally supportive. They couldn't give us, like time or resources, but they could acknowledge what everything was going through. And there were lots of stories that were being shared, and commiseration that was very community based within our college, which was really nice. And the dean like super spearheaded that and started that sharing with these weekly emails. And so we similarly had that kind of like, we're not alone support,
So at the, I was about to say, I think my university is an R1 institution, so the support they sent out kind of in the beginning was, some emails with, I guess, platitudes on like, hang in there, and thanks for showing up to teach students online, and some workshops and things like that, a few like webinars and things. They ended up offering to tenure track faculty. If we needed an extra year to go for tenure, we could automatically kind of get that granted to us. Once the initial shock kind of wore off, we, as I said, went kind of back to pushing for in-person pretty well. The administration was pushing for in-person pretty quickly, but while we weren't allowed to teach online come fall, if our classes beforehand were in person, we were allowed to call it hybrid and have in-person sessions, and it was kind of on the instructors to decide if those in-person sessions were mandatory or not. So for those of us who, like for me, in the middle of this, my mom had major surgery and had to live with me for quite a few months. As I said, 2020 was a great year. It's really a lot of things, but so I couldn't teach in person because I wasn't about to risk my mother's health, of course, or my students' health, because they all had similar situations to me. So we taught hybrid for the next year, and so I guess there was some support there and not pressuring me to be worrying, because we never enacted any form of mask or vaccine policies. So I couldn't have been in person without risking my family and my students' families.
Yeah, no, perfect. That was nice to hear the perspective from 4 different organizations there.
Luke?
Oh yeah.
Luke, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Second try here. There was one other thing. We don't have a lot of international students here, but we do have some, and they were stranded in 2020, and some of them had to stay over for weeks in the summer until air travel lightened up again. The university did take care of them. They opened up a food bank, for instance, to help keep them fed. So, and they did I don't know the details, but they were allowed to stay in campus dorms. So I imagine that was a problem at a lot of places.
Yeah. No, perfect. Thanks for adding that point about the international students. A question I'm seeing in the chat is, how is your interaction with students in terms of mentoring and advising changed as a result of the pandemic?
I think maybe it's gotten more honest, if that makes sense. So students have always been, I would say the students at USF or at least with me, which I'm really grateful for, they've always been pretty upfront with me about like what's going on in their life or like when they need something. But I noticed throughout the pandemic, they really started reaching out more and talking to me about it. And I know I felt too more comfortable saying, hey, listen, like I'm just really, I need some, I need like some extra time on this. Like I felt more ability to be honest and like saying, listen, I think I'm at my wit's end right now. I need a little bit of extra time to kind of take care of this here, and students were, I think, maybe more able to see like what it's like on the other side too. So not that, they should be, focusing on our needs or anything like that as students, but I feel like maybe it was a more honest communication where students were able to say, okay, here, this is how we can work together, or I'm going to be more upfront with you about my needs so that you can support me better, So I thought that that was actually a pretty good thing about the pandemic. And I think it made it easier for me to kind of reach out and talk to students who were struggling, where I think they felt more comfortable admitting to it for sure. Like, because in the past it'd be, hey, you haven't turned in any assignments. What's going on? Everything okay? Anything I can help you with? And this time they were more willing to be like, hey, things are falling apart. Please help. So that was nice that they had felt that they could be that honest.
I felt similar. I wasn't sure if it was me being at a new institution or the pandemic. I still can't figure out if that's the difference, but because I started at my institution during the pandemic, so I don't know. But I have found that to be very true as well. That the students are really not only open to sharing, but also willing to accept that like the rest of us are also having normal, just like life issues, and we're not just like these, sort of untouchable people that they but as far as like mentoring and advising goes too, it's because we have gotten really good at doing things flexibly and on the fly and changing to video and all that kind of stuff. That's added that component to a lot of the mentoring and advising that happens now. My lab group is all on Slack together. Everybody has that, and each project has their own little channel and what they're working on and stuff. And it makes it really nice because everybody will talk to each other through that, and video straight away, like, oh, I can't figure out this one thing in the lab. Can somebody, show me real quick? And it makes it much easier. People don't have to be there to help each other.
Yeah, I'll just echo what's been said already. I think, yeah, I don't need to add anything because I agree with all of it.
Well, to take another tack, the pandemic accelerated a trend that was already in process of making more of going from paper forms to electronic forms, so that you don't have to handle paper, you don't have to meet in person. We have more emailed discussions rather than meeting in person, and this has continued. And the advising process has really benefited from this because the electronic forms that they came up with are a lot clearer than what we had before. I mean, it will remind you if you're missing a course. So, and detail exactly what courses you need for a particular program. And if you think you might want to switch, you can it's just a few clicks away, and you can find out how close you are to finishing under that track instead. So that was an improvement.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you. The next question we have to focus on is what new opportunities, if any, became available to you due to the pandemic? I know we've already touched on some of these a little bit, but if you want to elaborate.
So I formed a Twitter group with a couple women on Twitter that I'd never met in person for the most part. And through the pandemic, we really started bonding a lot more and talking about some of the shared struggles that we were facing, primarily geoscientists in this particular case. And it actually ended up leading to one published paper so far, and more kind of coming down the pipeline in the next year or so. But just because of just kind of talking about commonalities we were noticing through this. And I felt like my university became more welcoming to me publishing about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was really nice because, not to put a negative spin on it, of course, but I had no access to my research specimens. So then I guess maybe it became, oh, okay, well, I guess as long as you're keeping busy. But now I feel like it's more of a welcomed aspect of my research, which is nice. So some new opportunities have come through that, which has been nice.
I would agree. I had something similar happen where I was doing some education research on classes and new implemented ideas and things that was just not supported, but like, oh, you're just doing that on your free time, kind of, they're just not necessarily interested in that. And then because we were making all these changes, and they were constantly changing during the pandemic, everybody was wondering, is this good? Does this work? Do we want to change to hybrid? Do we want to change to online? And then all of a sudden, the people who were doing research on pedagogy became, important people to talk to. And so then it turned out that there was much more support, both financially and in terms of oh, this is useful research type thinking, that changed that a lot and accelerated some of the work that maybe, again, was kind of being done in the background to then being, shown that it was important so that it could be brought to the forefront. And so a similar opportunity where it was already happening, but now it's really supported nicely. I'd also say that just collaboration in general has become a little bit easier. People are more willing to accept meeting this way, for example, or discussing new project ideas with people they've never met in person, for example. International collaboration has gotten a lot easier for me. And so that's opened up new opportunities because of it. People who I've been like, oh, it'll be really fun to work with them someday. Maybe I'll be able to go write a grant to go to their area. But then it turns out I don't have to if we can just, do it this way. And so that's been another huge component that I think is beneficial.
Yeah, I would sort of add, I would a +1 to that as well. I mean, it's sort of the, certainly, you know, I mentioned the sort of the idea that we developed a community of practice across the state. And I think establishing some of those relationships ultimately led to, I wrote a grant proposal with a colleague, and it was for a sort of statewide workshop that, because we'd sort of worked to develop these relationships virtually through this sort of online space, there was that trust to kind of recognize that what we were hoping to do would be able to be implemented. So I think it was sort of that we developed connections in virtual world that then ultimately led to an in-person kind of workshop. So I think, and then the work continues as a result of that online.
Well, y'all took the words out of my mouth about learning how to use Zoom with international collaborators, and it's marvelous. I mean, I grew up in a generation when you almost never did a long distance phone call because it would cost too much, and now, my goodness, the only problem is the different time zone. But you know, I've chatted for fun with people in Argentina over the last couple of years, almost the same time zone. So I'll just say, having done this, the 16th International ICNOFABRIC workshop online, it showed me one thing more than anything else. It's cheap. People don't have to travel. They're not constrained by the costs of lodging. We actually lowered the registration down to 0 for international people, which made it very easy, especially for grad students, to attend. So, and incidentally, people they tuned into this workshop at first saying, I hate Zoom. I don't want to do more Zoom. It's so terrible. We have to do Zoom. And 2 days later, after the workshop was over, with lots of free time, you know, we had no more than a couple of hours at a session, you know, lots of time for lunch and so on, so people could rest. People said, oh, it's so good to see you. We haven't seen you in 2 or 3 years. I'd love to see you again. Let's do this again soon. So, you know, this made me rethink how we do things. I'm much more amenable to meeting virtually now than I was before.
Yeah, no, perfect. Well said. We still have 4 minutes left, so see if we can touch on one more question here. We'll see how much of this we can answer. Going forward, where do you see virtual platforms being most useful in teaching and research? And has your department made any permanent plans to implement the use of virtual platforms for teaching and research? So it's kind of our outlook on virtual platforms for teaching and research activities.
I think accessibility is just the strongest one that we can kind of go into. So if we keep including these virtual components to conferences, we can include a whole host of folks that we were excluding before inadvertently. You know, my teaching is all on YouTube now with subtitles. So I have students all over the world watching my lectures. I'm getting supplemental stuff. My students who have a whole host of needs are able to watch the videos. They're learning a lot more. So I think really it's forcing many of us to be better educators, which is just a delightful side effect of it all, is that we're being much more intentional about including folks. And I'm hoping we don't lose that.
Yeah, I mentioned this a little bit before, but we are being pushed to incorporate more hybrid or completely virtual components. And I remember, not only is it for, you know, accessibility and utility for our students in the sense that they don't have to necessarily do the commute all the time, especially if they have work or children and things, most of them do, then the other thing is that we don't have more space on campus to create rooms that will accommodate more students, and so the online option lets us increase enrollment without having this problem of space. which is, administrative goal, I guess, is to increase enrollment and not have to build new buildings. But that's an added component that's really driving some of the push for these more virtual learning systems. The big thing is that, as Sarah was saying, being more intentional about our teaching. You can't just put on a PowerPoint and lecture as an online class, right? That's not a useful class at all. And so people are seeing that it doesn't work. And so a lot of people say, oh, online teaching doesn't work at all. But then other people who've been doing it for a long time and do it with all these fun and engaging and useful activities are like, it does work. You just have to put in the time and effort to make it really good. And so because they're pushing us to do that, we're getting support to do that. And I think they're not permanent changes yet, but there are plans to try to create more virtual components that are really engaging and not just a switch to, lecturing online kind of thing.
I would add sort of that access piece also means we're starting to talk more about this idea of high flex models, so that different students are accessing content in different ways, but still are all part of a collective class. And that again, we're actually struggling with enrollment. So trying to find new ways to bring students in is a piece. Plus also for international population, actually thinking about how do we potentially have our international students spend their first year at home and then be able to then come to the campus physically in their second year, so that then there's also some cost benefit for them as well.
Well, as I said, my college is implementing new programs that are wholly online, and this process is accelerated.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, guys. That's about all we have time for today. If you have any questions that were not addressed today, you can email us at webinars@americangeosciences.org, and we'll make sure to send your questions along to the speakers. We'll be posting the recording of today's webinar on our webinar webpage within a week, and we'll notify you once the recording is available. Thank you again to Andrew, Katja, Sarah, and Alyssa for sharing your time, expertise, and insight with us today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.